The lights inside the terminal flickered once, then steadied, and a voice on the speaker announced that every flight for the next 6 hours had been canceled. Emma Cole stood frozen at gate 14, her boarding pass crumpled in her hand, watching the snow outside turn the runway into a sheet of white nothing. She had exactly $112 in her account, a suitcase with a broken wheel, and nowhere to sleep tonight. Around her, the airport dissolved into noise. A child cried near the vending machines. An old man shouted at an airline worker who could do nothing but apologize. Emma pressed her palm against the cold window and watched a plane sit motionless on the tarmac, its wings already dusted white. She had been so close. 2 hours from home, 2 hours from the first quiet Christmas she had planned for herself in years. And now she was stuck. She turned from the window and nearly walked straight into a man crossing the aisle with a paper cup of coffee in his hand. The impact was small but enough. The cup tipped, and hot coffee splashed across the sleeve of his charcoal coat. "I am so sorry," Emma said quickly, already reaching for the napkins in her bag. "I wasn't looking where I was going." The man did not answer right away. He looked at his sleeve, then at her, with an expression that was hard to read. Not quite anger, but not patience either. He was tall, dressed like someone who belonged in a boardroom rather than a snowbound airport, his dark hair combed back, his jaw set in a line that suggested he was used to people apologizing to him rather than the other way around. "It's fine," he said finally, his voice low and controlled. "It's just coffee." "Let me buy you another one," Emma offered, though she wasn't sure how, given her budget. "That won't be necessary." He pulled a handkerchief from his coat pocket and wiped at the stain without much success. "Every coffee shop in this terminal will be a disaster by tonight anyway." Emma almost smiled at that, despite everything. "You're not wrong." He studied her for a moment longer than felt natural, as if trying to place her, then walked past without another word. Emma watched him go, a strange flutter in her chest that she quickly dismissed as leftover panic from the flight cancellation. She had bigger problems than a stranger with an expensive coat. She made her way toward the customer service counter, where a line had already formed, twisting back on itself 3 times through the roped stanchions. She took her place at the end and pulled out her phone to check the news. The storm, according to every headline, was the worst in a decade. Planes across 4 states were grounded. Airports as far as 300 miles away were reporting the same chaos. An hour passed, then another. The line moved so slowly that Emma began to wonder if it was moving at all. When she finally reached the counter, the airline representative, a woman with tired eyes and a headset crooked on one ear, delivered the news without much sympathy left in her voice. "All flights are canceled until at least tomorrow afternoon, possibly later depending on the storm. We can rebook you, but the earliest available seat is 3 days from now." "3 days," Emma repeated. "Is there a hotel voucher or—" "Every hotel within 20 miles is already booked. I'm sorry. There's nothing we can offer beyond the rebooking." Emma thanked her, though she didn't feel thankful for anything, and stepped away from the counter with her suitcase dragging behind her on its one working wheel. She found an empty bench near a darkened coffee kiosk and sat down, pulling her coat tighter around her shoulders. The terminal had grown colder as the night wore on, the heating system apparently struggling to keep up with the storm outside. She thought about calling her friend Grace, the one she had been flying to see, but Grace had already left for a family emergency 2 days earlier and wouldn't be back until after the holiday. There was no one else to call. Her parents had passed years ago, and the small apartment she rented in the city suddenly felt very far away and very empty. She wrapped her arms around her knees and stared at the drifting snow outside the window, feeling, for the first time in a long while, truly and completely alone. Somewhere across the terminal, Julian Hart stood at a different window, phone pressed to his ear, listening to his assistant explain that his private jet was also grounded, along with everything else on the runway. He exhaled slowly and rubbed a hand across his face. He had important meetings scheduled for the 26th, a signing that had taken 8 months to arrange, and if he wasn't back by then, it would fall apart. "Find another way," he said into the phone. "Charter something. I don't care what it costs." "Sir, nothing is flying," his assistant replied. "Not even helicopters. The storm has grounded everything in a 400-mile radius." Julian ended the call without saying goodbye, which was unlike him, but the frustration sitting in his chest left little room for manners. He was used to solving problems with money or influence, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, neither was going to help him. He was stuck, just like everyone else in this crowded, overheated, understaffed terminal, and the realization irritated him more than he wanted to admit. He walked the length of the concourse twice, partly to think, and partly because sitting still made the frustration worse. On his second pass, he noticed the same woman from earlier, the one who had spilled his coffee, sitting alone on a bench near a closed kiosk, her knees pulled to her chest, her eyes fixed somewhere far away. There was something about the way she sat, so still, so composed despite whatever she was clearly feeling, that made him slow his steps. He told himself it wasn't his concern. People were stranded everywhere tonight. It wasn't his job to notice each one of them. And yet he found himself walking toward her anyway, unsure exactly why. "No luck with rebooking either?" he asked, stopping a few feet from the bench. Emma looked up, startled out of her thoughts. It took her a second to recognize him as the man from the coffee incident. "3 days," she said. "You?" "Everything is grounded. I'm told even helicopters can't fly in this." He glanced around the terminal, taking in the sprawl of stranded passengers settling in for the night on the floor, on benches, against walls. "It seems we're all here for a while." "Seems that way." Emma tried to keep her voice light, though the exhaustion was beginning to show through. "At least there's good company." He almost smiled at that, the corner of his mouth twitching upward before he caught himself. "I don't know about good, but there is a lot of it." There was a pause between them, not quite comfortable but not entirely awkward either. Emma studied him for a moment, curious despite herself. He didn't look like someone who spent much time in crowded places, let alone a storm-locked airport with strangers sleeping on the floor around him. His shoes alone probably cost more than her rent. "I take it you don't usually fly commercial," she said, immediately regretting the comment as too forward. To her surprise, he laughed, a short, quiet sound that seemed almost rusty from disuse. "No, I don't. Which perhaps explains why I have no idea what to do with myself right now." "Welcome to the real world," Emma said, gesturing at the crowded terminal. "Population. Everyone's stuck here tonight." He looked around at the scene again, at families curled up together, at a group of college students sharing snacks from a vending machine, at an elderly couple with a single blanket between them. Something about it struck him differently this time, not as an inconvenience, but as a strange kind of community forming out of necessity. "I'm Julian," he said, extending a hand. "Emma." She shook it, noting that his grip was firm but not overbearing. "Well, Emma, since it looks like we're both here until further notice, would you like to sit somewhere with actual chairs? I have access to one of the airline lounges. It won't be luxurious tonight, given the circumstances, but it will be warmer than this bench, and there might still be food." Emma hesitated. Going anywhere with a stranger, however polished his coat and however kind his offer, wasn't something she did without thought. But the cold in the terminal was seeping through her jacket, and the idea of a warm chair and real food after the day she'd had was difficult to refuse. "Why would you offer that to someone who spilled coffee on you 2 hours ago?" she asked, only half joking. Julian considered the question seriously, as if it deserved a real answer. "Because it's Christmas in 2 days, and it seems wrong to let you freeze on a bench when there's a warm room 50 feet away. Also," he added, "I think you might be the only honest person I've spoken to all day. Everyone else has been trying to sell me something." Emma studied his face, looking for some sign of insincerity, and found none. There was something tired in his eyes, something that matched the loneliness she had been trying not to feel all evening. Maybe it was the storm. Maybe it was the holiday pressing down on both of them. Or maybe it was simply that two strangers, stripped of their usual armor by exhaustion and circumstance, could recognize something true in each other. "All right," she said finally, standing and gathering her broken suitcase. "Lead the way." They walked together through the crowded terminal, past the sleeping families and the tired airline staff, and the windows still filling with snow. Two people who, an hour earlier, had been complete strangers moving through their own separate storms. Neither of them could have guessed, in that moment, how much the next few days would change everything they thought they knew about loneliness, about trust, and about the unexpected places where a person might find exactly what they didn't know they were looking for. Outside, the snow kept falling, steady and relentless, closing off every road and runway for miles, sealing the airport into its own small world until the storm decided to let go. The airline lounge was quieter than the rest of the terminal, though not by much. A handful of other stranded travelers had already found their way inside, claiming corners of the room with blankets pulled from overhead bins and bags stacked as makeshift pillows. A television in the corner played the news on mute, showing images of snowbound highways and closed runways across the region. Julian led Emma to a pair of chairs near the window, away from the crowd, where the view stretched out over the white runway and the storm still churning above it. "This is better," Emma admitted, sinking into the chair. The cushions were worn but soft, and the warmth of the room settled over her like a blanket. "Thank you for this." "Don't thank me yet," Julian said, glancing toward the small buffet table near the entrance, where trays of sandwiches sat half picked over. "The food selection is questionable at best." Emma laughed, the sound surprising her. It was the first time she had laughed all day. "At this point, I'd eat cardboard if it were warm." Julian retrieved 2 plates and returned with sandwiches, a handful of crackers, and 2 bottles of water, setting them down on the small table between their chairs. Emma took the food gratefully, suddenly aware of how hungry she had been without noticing it. "So," Julian said, settling into his own chair, "where were you flying to, before all of this?" "Home," Emma said, though the word felt strange as she said it. "Well, not exactly home. My parents passed away a few years ago, so home is more of an idea now. I was flying to see a friend for Christmas. She lives near the coast." "Was flying," Julian repeated. "Past tense. She had a family emergency 2 days ago. She's already gone. I was still going to fly out because I'd already booked the ticket, and honestly, I didn't want to spend Christmas alone in my apartment." Emma shrugged, trying to make it sound lighter than it felt. Turns out the universe had other plans. Julian was quiet for a moment, turning his water bottle slowly in his hands. "I'm sorry. That sounds like a difficult few years." "It's manageable," Emma said, and meant it. "What about you? Where were you headed?" "Nowhere as important as it felt 3 hours ago," Julian admitted. "I run a company. Real estate, mostly commercial developments. I had a signing scheduled for the 26th that I was flying home to prepare for. It's taken months to arrange, and now I'm sitting in an airport lounge eating a sandwich that's seen better days. Sounds stressful." "It is, or it was, until about an hour ago." He glanced at her, something unreadable in his expression. Strange how quickly priorities shift when you realize there's nothing you can do to fix a situation. I've spent my whole life fixing things. Tonight, I can't fix anything. Emma considered that for a moment, turning her own water bottle in her hands the way he had done with his. Maybe that's not the worst thing. Sometimes you just have to sit still and let things happen the way they're going to happen. "Is that what you do?" Julian asked, an edge of curiosity in his voice. "Sit still and let things happen?" "Not usually," Emma admitted. "I like plans. I like knowing what's coming next. Tonight is breaking every rule I have about that. Then we're both out of our element." They fell into an easy conversation after that, the kind that neither of them had expected from a chance encounter in a snowbound airport. Emma told him about her work as a junior architect, about the small apartment she was slowly making her own, about the plans she'd had for a quiet Christmas with Grace before everything fell apart. Julian, in turn, spoke carefully at first, then more openly, about the company his father had built and the responsibility he carried to keep it thriving, about the family gatherings that had become more obligation than celebration over the years, about how long it had been since anyone had asked him a question that wasn't about business. As the night wore on, the lounge grew quieter around them. Other travelers settled into sleep. The television dimmed its volume further, and the storm outside continued to press its snow against the windows. Emma noticed, at some point, that the room had grown cold again as the heating system struggled against the weather, and she pulled her thin jacket tighter around herself. Julian noticed too. Without a word, he stood, retrieved his coat from where he had draped it over the back of his chair, and set it gently across her shoulders. "I don't need," Emma started. "You're shivering," he said simply. "I'm fine." She wanted to argue, but the warmth of the coat settling over her, still holding some trace of his own warmth, made the protest die in her throat. "Thank you," she said instead, quieter this time. Julian sat back down, watching the snow outside rather than her, though Emma noticed the small, satisfied set of his shoulders, as if the gesture had given him something he hadn't expected to feel tonight. A short while later, an elderly man a few chairs away began to shift restlessly, clearly cold despite the thin blanket wrapped around him. Julian excused himself and returned a few minutes later, having found an extra blanket from an airline staff member, which he draped over the man without making a show of it, simply setting it down and returning to his seat as if it were nothing at all. Emma watched the exchange with quiet interest. "That was kind," she said when he sat back down. "It was nothing," Julian replied, though something in his tone suggested he wasn't used to being noticed for such things. It wasn't nothing to him. Julian didn't respond right away, and Emma let the silence sit between them, comfortable rather than awkward. She was beginning to understand that the cold, commanding impression he gave off in public was only part of the picture, a shell built for boardrooms and business deals, and that underneath it was someone who noticed small kindnesses and offered them quietly, without needing credit. "Can I ask you something?" Emma said after a while. "Go ahead. Why does a person who runs an entire company end up flying commercial in the middle of a snowstorm? Don't you have people to handle travel disasters for you?" Julian huffed a quiet laugh. "Normally, yes. I have an assistant who handles nearly everything, but I made the decision to fly out on my own this time, without the usual arrangements, because I wanted a few hours without anyone asking me for a decision. Ironic, given how the night turned out. So even a person with everything wants to disappear sometimes." "Everyone wants to disappear sometimes," Julian said, looking at her directly now. "Some people just have more ways of doing it than others." Emma held his gaze for a moment longer than she meant to, something warm and unfamiliar settling in her chest. She looked away first, focusing on the snow outside the window instead, though the feeling lingered. They talked for hours after that, about small things and large ones, about favorite books and childhood memories, and the strange, quiet way a snowstorm could make the whole world feel smaller and closer at the same time. At some point, exhaustion caught up with Emma, and her eyes grew heavy, despite her best efforts to stay awake. Julian noticed before she did, watching as her head began to nod forward, her words slowing between sentences. "You should sleep," he said gently. "It's been a long day." "I don't want to be rude," Emma murmured, already fighting a losing battle against her own tiredness. "You won't be. I'll be here." She hesitated only a moment before letting her eyes close, curling into the chair with his coat still wrapped around her shoulders. Julian stayed awake a while longer, watching the snow fall outside the window, listening to the quiet sounds of the lounge settling into sleep around him. He thought about the sandwich, the coffee stain still faintly visible on his sleeve, the strange turn his evening had taken. He thought, too, about how easily the evening could have gone differently, how he could have walked past the bench without stopping, could have spent the night alone with his frustration and his phone, could have missed entirely the quiet, unexpected comfort of a conversation with someone who wanted nothing from him except honesty. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Julian Hart did not feel the need to fix anything, solve anything, or control anything. He simply sat, watching the snow, letting the storm hold him exactly where he was. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the windows and sending fresh snow swirling across the empty runway. Inside, the lounge stayed warm and quiet, holding its small collection of stranded travelers safely through the night, while two strangers who were quickly becoming something more sat close together, waiting for the storm to pass. Morning arrived slowly, filtered through frost-covered windows and the gray light of a sky still heavy with clouds. Emma woke first, disoriented for a moment by the unfamiliar surroundings, before the memory of the night before settled back into place. She was still wrapped in Julian's coat, curled sideways in the lounge chair, and across from her, Julian sat with his eyes closed, his head tilted slightly against the back of his own chair, finally asleep after what must have been hours of staying awake to watch over the room. She studied him for a moment in the quiet morning light, noting how different he looked without the guarded expression he wore in conversation. Younger, somehow. Less like the man who ran an empire, and more like someone who simply needed rest. Around them, the lounge was beginning to stir. The elderly man from the night before was awake, folding the blanket Julian had brought him with careful, grateful hands. A family nearby was sharing the last of a bag of pretzels among 3 children, who seemed more excited by the adventure of an airport sleepover than upset by the delay. Emma allowed herself a small smile at the sight before turning her attention to the window, where the snow had finally stopped falling, leaving behind a world blanketed in white silence. Julian stirred a few minutes later, blinking awake with the particular disorientation of someone unused to sleeping anywhere but a proper bed. He straightened in his chair, running a hand through his hair, and it took him a moment to remember where he was and why. "Good morning," Emma said, amused by his obvious confusion. "Is it?" Julian glanced toward the window, taking in the stilled snow and the pale morning light. "The storm stopped. About an hour ago, I think. I didn't want to wake you." "You should have. You were awake half the night because of me." "I slept fine," Emma said, gesturing to the coat still around her shoulders. "Better than fine, actually. Thank you for this." Julian waved off the thanks, though something in his expression suggested he was pleased regardless. He reached for his phone, which had been charging in an outlet near his chair, and scrolled quickly through a series of messages that had accumulated overnight. His expression shifted as he read, the ease of the morning giving way to something more focused. "What is it?" Emma asked, noticing the change. "Flights are being reviewed for a possible restart later today, but with this much snow, it will take time to clear the runways properly. Realistically, we're looking at tomorrow at the earliest, maybe the day after." He set the phone down, exhaling slowly. "Christmas Eve, if we're lucky. Christmas Day, if we're not." Emma felt her stomach drop slightly at the thought of spending Christmas in an airport terminal, sleeping in borrowed chairs, eating sandwiches from a half-empty buffet table. She had expected the flight delay to be an inconvenience, not an entire holiday lost to fluorescent lighting and recycled air. "I suppose there are worse places to spend Christmas," she said, trying to keep her voice light despite the disappointment settling in her chest. Julian studied her for a long moment, something working behind his eyes that Emma couldn't quite place. Finally, he spoke, his voice careful, as if testing the words before fully committing to them. "You mentioned your friend already left, and that you don't have family nearby." "That's right," Emma said slowly, unsure where this was going. "I have a family estate not far from here, about 2 hours by car once the road's clear. My family gathers there every year for Christmas. It's not exactly warm in the emotional sense, but it is warm in the literal sense, and there will be more food than an airport buffet could ever offer." He paused, seeming almost surprised by his own words. "I'd like to invite you to spend Christmas there, if the road's clear in time, and if you'd be comfortable with it." Emma stared at him, certain for a moment that she had misheard. "You want me to spend Christmas with your family?" People you haven't mentioned once tonight except in passing. I'm aware of how it sounds, Julian said, a faint, self-deprecating smile touching his mouth. But the alternative is you spending Christmas alone in a terminal, and I find that I don't like that idea very much. Julian, we met yesterday. Over spilled coffee. I'm aware of that too. He held her gaze steadily, none of the usual guardedness in his expression now. I don't make this kind of offer often. I don't think I've ever made it, actually. But something about last night made it feel like the right thing to do, and I've learned to trust that feeling, even when it doesn't entirely make sense. Emma looked down at the coat still wrapped around her shoulders, feeling the weight of the decision pressing against her chest. Every practical instinct she had told her this was too fast, too strange, too much of a leap to take with a man she had known for less than a day. And yet, beneath the caution, there was something else. A quiet, persistent pull toward saying yes, toward trusting the same feeling Julian had just described. I don't want to intrude on a family gathering, she said finally, especially not with everything that comes with it. Expectations, questions, whatever your family will think when you show up with someone they've never met. Let me worry about my family, Julian said. You let me worry about the expectations. All I'm asking is whether you'd like somewhere warm to spend Christmas, with people who, whatever their flaws, do put together a decent holiday dinner. Emma laughed despite herself, some of the tension in her chest easing at his tone. That's quite a sales pitch. I run a company. I'm told I'm persuasive. I noticed. Emma considered the offer a moment longer, weighing the strangeness of it against the alternative. Another day, possibly two, spent in this terminal, surrounded by strangers, with nowhere to go and no one to share the holiday with. When she thought of it that way, the choice became easier than she expected. All right, if the road's clear and the offer still stands, I'll come. Something shifted in Julian's expression at her answer, a warmth breaking through the composed exterior he usually wore, brief but genuine. Good, he said simply. I think you'll find the estate more interesting than this lounge, at the very least. The rest of the morning passed in a strange, suspended calm. Airport staff moved through the terminal with updates on the runway clearing efforts. Snowplows visible through the windows working steadily across the tarmac. Emma and Julian spent the hours in easy conversation, occasionally interrupted by announcements over the speaker system or updates on Julian's phone from his assistant, who seemed both relieved and mildly alarmed by the change in his employer's travel plans. By early afternoon, word came that the roads outside the airport, at least the major highways, had been cleared enough for careful travel, even if the runways themselves remained closed for further inspection. Julian made a call, his voice shifting into the crisp, efficient tone Emma imagined he used in his usual business dealings, arranging for a car to collect them from the terminal. The car will take about 40 minutes to arrive, he said, ending the call. Are you ready for this? Emma looked around the lounge one last time, at the space that had somehow become the setting for the strangest and most unexpected turn her holiday had ever taken. As ready as I'll ever be, she said. Julian smiled, a real smile this time, unguarded in a way she hadn't seen from him yet. Then let's go make Christmas a little less predictable. Together, they gathered their bags, Emma's battered suitcase with its broken wheel, Julian's sleek leather case that looked as though it had never seen hardship a day in its life, and made their way toward the terminal exit, where the snow-plowed roads waited beyond the glass doors, leading toward a family estate and a holiday neither of them could have predicted 24 hours earlier. Behind them, the airport lounge settled back into its quiet rhythm, the small community of stranded travelers slowly beginning their own journeys onward, each carrying some piece of the strange, storm-bound night that had briefly brought them all together. Outside, the sky had cleared to a pale winter blue, sunlight glinting off the fresh snow in a way that made the whole world look, for a moment, entirely new. The car moved carefully along roads still lined with plowed snow, passing through towns that had begun to wake from the storm, their windows lit with holiday lights against the gray afternoon. Emma sat with her forehead nearly against the window, watching the landscape shift from busy highway to quiet countryside, fields stretching white and empty on either side of the road. Beside her, Julian answered a steady stream of calls, his voice moving between business efficiency and something gentler whenever he glanced her way between conversations. "Sorry," he said, ending another call. "The office doesn't understand the concept of a holiday." "It's fine," Emma said. "I can't imagine how much is waiting for you after a night like that. Nothing that can't wait a few more hours." He set the phone aside, giving her his full attention for the first time since they'd left the airport. "We're about 20 minutes out. I should probably warn you about a few things before we arrive." "That sounds ominous." "Not ominous. Just complicated." Julian paused, choosing his words carefully. "My father built the company from nothing, and he still treats every family gathering like a board meeting. My mother passed several years ago, and things have felt different since then. More formal, less warm. My sister Olivia will likely ask you a dozen questions within the first 10 minutes, mostly out of curiosity rather than suspicion, and my father will probably ask what you do for a living within the first 5. "Noted," Emma said, absorbing the information with more calm than she felt. "Anything else?" "Just that none of them will know quite what to make of this. I don't typically bring anyone home. Ever, actually." "No pressure, then," Emma said dryly, and Julian laughed, some of the tension easing from his shoulders. "No pressure," he agreed. "Just be yourself. That will be more than enough." The estate appeared ahead of them a short while later, framed by tall pine trees heavy with snow, its stone facade rising 3 stories against the pale sky. Warm light glowed from nearly every window, and smoke curled steadily from one of the chimneys, giving the whole scene the look of something pulled from a holiday card rather than real life. Emma felt a flutter of nerves settle into her stomach as the car pulled up the long driveway, coming to a stop before a set of wide stone steps leading to the front entrance. "It's beautiful," she said quietly. "It's a lot of things," Julian replied, an unreadable note in his voice as he studied the house. "Beautiful is one of them." They stepped out of the car into the crisp winter air, and the front door opened before they reached the top of the steps, revealing a woman in her late 20s, with dark hair pulled into a loose braid, and an expression of open curiosity that immediately reminded Emma of Julian, though warmer, less guarded. "You actually brought someone," the woman said, looking between Julian and Emma with undisguised interest. "I didn't believe Daniel when he told me." "Olivia, this is Emma," Julian said, a note of warning in his tone that his sister clearly chose to ignore. "Emma, my sister Olivia." "It's wonderful to meet you," Olivia said, extending a hand with genuine warmth. Come in, you must be freezing." Julian never mentioned he was bringing a guest, which, knowing my brother, means this is either very serious or a complete accident. "I'm dying to find out which." "Olivia," Julian said again, though there was fondness beneath the warning this time. Emma laughed despite her nerves, taking Olivia's offered hand. "A bit of both, I think. We met at the airport during the storm." "The storm love story," Olivia said with delight, leading them both into the entryway, where warmth and the scent of pine and roasting food immediately enveloped them. "I love it already. Father is going to have so many questions." The inside of the house was as impressive as its exterior, high ceilings and dark wood paneling giving way to rooms decorated with careful, restrained holiday touches. A large tree in the main hall, its lights soft and warm rather than garish, garlands wrapped along the staircase railing, the low murmur of a fire crackling somewhere out of sight. Despite its grandeur, Emma noticed a certain stillness to the house, as though the warmth of the decorations hadn't quite reached the walls themselves. A tall man appeared from a side hallway as they made their way further into the house, his silver hair and sharp gaze immediately marking him as Julian's father. He studied Emma with an assessing look before turning his attention to his son. "You're late," he said, by way of greeting. "I assumed the storm had grounded you entirely." It nearly did, Julian replied, his posture straightening slightly, the ease he'd shown in the car giving way to something more careful. Father, this is Emma. Emma, my father, Nathaniel Hart. Emma, Nathaniel repeated, extending a hand with formal politeness. And what is it you do, Emma? I'm a junior architect, Emma answered, keeping her tone steady despite the weight of his gaze. Mostly residential projects, though I'm hoping to move into larger commercial work eventually. Something flickered in Nathaniel's expression, faint interest breaking through the formal exterior. Commercial work. Julian's company handles quite a bit of that. Perhaps you two have more in common than a snowstorm. Perhaps, Julian said smoothly, though Emma caught the slight tension in his jaw at his father's comment. The introductions continued through the afternoon, a rotating cast of relatives and family friends arriving for the holiday gathering, each greeting Julian with a mixture of respect and formality that Emma found curious, given how different he had seemed during their long night in the airport lounge. Here, surrounded by his family and the weight of expectations that clearly came with the Hart name, he carried himself differently, more guarded, more careful with his words. Emma found herself seated beside Olivia during a quiet moment in the late afternoon, the two of them tucked into a window seat overlooking the snow-covered gardens, while the rest of the house buzzed with preparation for the evening meal. He's different with you, Olivia said, watching her brother across the room as he spoke with a distant cousin near the fireplace. Warmer. I don't know if you've noticed, but Julian doesn't usually let people see much beyond the version of him that runs meetings and closes deals. I have noticed, Emma admitted, though I think being here changes something in him too. He seems more careful. That would be Father, Olivia said, a knowing look crossing her face. Julian has spent his whole life trying to live up to expectations that were set before he could even walk. It's exhausting, watching him carry it, especially at Christmas, when it should be easier than this. Was it always like this? The formality, I mean. Olivia considered the question, her gaze drifting toward the garden outside. Not always. Things were warmer when our mother was alive. She had a way of softening Father, of reminding him that the holidays were meant to be about more than appearances. Since she passed, it's been harder to find that same warmth. We manage, but it's different. Emma absorbed this quietly, understanding a little more now about the guarded weight she had noticed in Julian since arriving. The version of him she had met at the airport, exhausted and unguarded in the middle of a storm, felt like a different person entirely from the one navigating his father's expectations in this grand, beautiful, strangely cold house. As the afternoon gave way to evening, the family gathered for dinner in a long dining room, lit by candlelight, the table set with more silver and china than Emma had ever seen outside of a photograph. Conversation moved formally around the table, punctuated by Nathaniel's pointed questions about business and Olivia's efforts to keep the mood lighter, with stories from her own work as a photographer. Emma found herself seated beside Julian, grateful for his quiet presence beside her as she navigated the unfamiliar rhythms of the family's traditions. Later, after the meal had ended and most of the family had retired to the sitting room for the evening, Julian found Emma standing alone near the tall windows in the main hall, watching snow begin to fall again outside. "You survived dinner," he said, coming to stand beside her. "Barely," Emma said with a small laugh. "Your father asks a lot of questions. He does that with everyone. It's his way of deciding whether someone is worth his time." Julian paused, studying her profile in the soft light from the windows. "For what it's worth, I think you passed." "High praise," Emma said, turning to look at him. "Your sister mentioned things have been different since your mother passed. I hope I'm not overstepping by saying that." Julian's expression shifted, something quieter and more vulnerable breaking through the composed exterior he had worn most of the evening. "You're not overstepping. She's right. Things changed after that. My father buried himself in work, and I suppose I followed his example without ever really deciding to. It's strange, having someone here who notices these things. Most people who visit only see the house, the name, the money. They don't see what's underneath it." I think what's underneath it is worth noticing, Emma said quietly. Julian looked at her for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them in the candlelit hall, snow falling steadily beyond the windows. Neither of them moved to close the distance between them, though the pull to do so was unmistakable, hovering in the quiet air of the house like an unfinished sentence waiting to be completed. "Thank you for coming," Julian said finally, his voice low. "I don't think I realized how much I needed someone here who wasn't part of all this until you walked through that door." "Thank you for asking me," Emma replied. "I don't think I realized how much I needed somewhere to go." Outside, the snow continued to fall, gathering softly against the windows of the old estate, while inside, two people who had met only a day earlier in the chaos of a storm stood quietly together, beginning to understand that whatever this was between them, it was only just beginning to unfold. The days that followed settled into a rhythm Emma hadn't expected to find inside such a grand and formal house. Mornings began early, with the household stirring to the smell of coffee and fresh bread from the kitchen, followed by long stretches of quiet before the family gathered again for meals that always felt, to Emma, like small performances rather than simple dinners. Between those structured hours, she found pockets of freedom, and it was in those pockets that she began to see the estate, and Julian, in a different light. On the second morning, she woke early, unable to sleep past dawn out of habit, and found her way down to the kitchen, where a young member of the household staff named Grace was already preparing breakfast. Grace, cheerful and unbothered by Emma's unexpected presence, handed her a cup of coffee and began talking easily, the way people do when they assume familiarity rather than waiting for it. "You're the one from the airport," Grace said, not unkindly. "Word travels fast in this house. Olivia's been telling everyone about the Storm love story since you arrived." Emma laughed, accepting the coffee gratefully. "It's not quite a love story. We only met 2 days ago." "Give it time," Grace said with a knowing smile, returning to the stove. "This house could use a bit of that kind of thing. It's been too quiet around here for too long." Emma took her coffee to the window, looking out over the snow-covered gardens, and found herself thinking about Grace's words longer than she meant to. The estate was beautiful, undeniably so, but there was a hollowness to it that matched what Olivia had described the day before. Grand and well-maintained on the surface, but missing something essential underneath. Julian found her there a short while later, dressed more casually than she had yet seen him, in a simple sweater that made him look younger, less like the composed executive she had first met at the airport. "You're an early riser," he said, joining her at the window. "Old habit. What's your excuse?" "I never really stopped being one, even when I try to sleep in." He glanced toward the garden outside. "Would you like to see the grounds? They're better in daylight than they looked when we arrived." Emma agreed, and they spent the next hour walking together through the snow-covered gardens behind the house, following a stone path that wound past a frozen fountain and a small greenhouse still holding a few hardy winter plants. Julian talked more freely out here, away from the watchful presence of his father and the formal weight of the house itself, telling Emma stories about summers spent in these same gardens as a child, before the company had claimed so much of his time, before the distance between himself and his father had grown into the careful, formal thing it was now. "It wasn't always like this," he said, echoing what Olivia had told her the day before. "My mother used to spend hours out here. She had a way of making everything feel less serious, even the business side of things. I think that's part of why my father struggles now. Without her, everything feels like it has to be earned, has to be justified." "Is that how you feel too?" Emma asked. "Like everything has to be earned?" Julian considered the question longer than she expected. "I think I've spent so long believing that, I forgot to ask whether it was actually true." He glanced at her, something open and unguarded in his expression. "You have a way of asking questions no one else bothers to ask." "Someone has to," Emma said with a small smile, and Julian laughed, the sound easy and genuine in the quiet morning air. Their walk was interrupted by the arrival of a car in the driveway, visible through the trees, and Julian's expression shifted almost immediately, the ease of the morning giving way to something more guarded. "Business partner," he said, glancing toward the house. "I forgot he was stopping by today. I'm sorry, I should—" "Go," Emma said. "I'll be fine out here a little longer." Julian hesitated, clearly reluctant to end the morning, before nodding and making his way back toward the house. Emma watched him go, then turned her attention back to the frozen garden, feeling, for the first time since arriving, a small measure of the peace that must have once filled this place before circumstances had worn it down into something quieter and more careful. She spent the rest of the morning exploring the grounds on her own, eventually finding her way to a small stone bench near the edge of the property, overlooking a frozen pond that, in warmer months, must have been a striking centerpiece for the gardens. She sat there for a long while, thinking about the strange turn her holiday had taken, about the man she had met over spilled coffee who had somehow become the center of an unexpected Christmas, and about the quiet ache of hope beginning to form in her chest, one she wasn't entirely sure what to do with. That afternoon, the family gathered in the main sitting room for a tradition Olivia explained as the annual decorating of the smaller tree in the library, a task usually reserved for the younger members of the family and, this year, extended to Emma as well. The room felt warmer than the rest of the house, filled with laughter as Olivia recounted stories of past Christmases gone wrong, ornaments broken, lights tangled beyond repair, one memorable year when the tree itself had toppled over entirely. Nathaniel joined partway through, standing near the doorway rather than participating directly, though Emma noticed him watching the scene with an expression that softened slightly as the afternoon wore on. At one point, as Emma reached to hang an ornament on a high branch, she overheard him speaking quietly to Julian near the fireplace. "She's good for you," Nathaniel said, his voice low enough that he likely didn't realize Emma could hear. "I haven't seen you like this in years, not since before your mother passed." "It's only been a few days, Father," Julian replied, though there was no argument in his tone, only a kind of quiet acknowledgement. "Sometimes a few days is enough to see something clearly," Nathaniel said, before moving away to greet another arriving relative, leaving Julian standing near the fire with an expression Emma couldn't quite read from across the room. Later that evening, after the tree had been fully decorated and the family had scattered to their various rooms to rest before the following day's festivities, Emma found herself again near the tall windows in the main hall, drawn there by the quiet and the view of the snow-covered gardens beyond. Julian joined her a short while later, 2 cups of hot chocolate in his hands, offering one to her as he came to stand beside her at the window. "Grace's recipe," he said. "She insists it's the only thing that makes this house feel like Christmas." Emma accepted the cup gratefully, the warmth spreading through her hands as she took a sip. She might be right. They stood together in comfortable silence for a while, watching the snow drift softly past the window in the moonlight. Emma thought about the conversation she had overheard between Julian and his father, about the quiet warmth that seemed to be slowly returning to this house since her arrival, fragile but undeniably present. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally. "Always. Are you happy? Really happy, I mean. Not just managing, not just handling things the way you handle everything else." Julian was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the same seriousness he had given every question she had asked him since the airport. "I don't know if I've asked myself that in a long time," he admitted. "But standing here, right now, I think the answer might be yes. Which is strange, considering how the last few days began." "Strange things sometimes turn out to be exactly what we needed," Emma said quietly. Julian turned to look at her fully then, something warm and searching in his expression, and for a moment, the distance between them seemed to close entirely, drawn together by the quiet intimacy of the moment, the soft light of the hall, the snow falling steadily beyond the glass. Neither of them spoke, though the air between them felt charged with everything neither of them had yet said aloud. A door opened somewhere down the hall, footsteps approaching, and the moment dissolved as quickly as it had formed, both of them stepping back slightly, the spell broken but not entirely gone. Olivia appeared a moment later, oblivious to what she had interrupted, cheerfully reminding them both that tomorrow was Christmas Eve, and that the household would be busy from early morning, preparing for the evening's celebration. "Get some rest, you two," she said, disappearing back down the hall with a knowing smile that suggested she had noticed more than she let on. Emma and Julian exchanged a glance, something unspoken but understood passing between them, before saying their quiet goodnights and retreating to their separate rooms. Emma lay awake for a long while afterward, staring at the ceiling of the guest room, thinking about the moment at the window, about the warmth in Julian's eyes, about the strange, unexpected gift this storm had given her, one she was only beginning to understand the full shape of. Outside, the snow continued to fall over the quiet estate, blanketing the gardens and the frozen pond and the long driveway in fresh white silence, while inside, two people lay awake in separate rooms, each thinking of the other, each wondering what tomorrow, Christmas Eve, might bring. Christmas Eve arrived with a flurry of activity that swept through the estate from the earliest hours of the morning. The kitchen staff worked steadily to prepare the evening feast, the scent of roasting meat and fresh bread drifting through the halls by mid-morning, while Olivia directed a small army of relatives in stringing additional lights along the staircase and hanging fresh garlands above the main entrance. Emma found herself swept into the preparations almost immediately, grateful for the distraction from the thoughts that had kept her awake much of the night. She spent the morning helping Olivia arrange place settings in the dining room, the two of them falling into easy conversation as they worked. "You didn't sleep much either, did you?" Olivia asked, arranging a centerpiece of pine branches and red ribbon at the center of the table. "Is it that obvious?" Emma asked, setting down a stack of napkins. "Only to someone who's watched her brother mope around a Christmas tree at midnight more than once in her life." Olivia smiled, though there was genuine warmth beneath the teasing. "Whatever happened between you two last night, I'd say it's working." Emma felt heat rise in her cheeks despite herself. "Nothing happened. We were just talking." Olivia didn't look convinced, though she let the subject drop, returning her attention to the centerpiece with a satisfied smile. Julian appeared periodically throughout the day, pulled in different directions by his father's requests, phone calls from the office that refused to fully honor the holiday, and the general chaos of hosting an extended family gathering. Each time their paths crossed, Emma noticed a familiar warmth in his expression, quiet but unmistakable, a silent acknowledgement of the moment they had shared the night before, even amid the busyness surrounding them. By late afternoon, the house had transformed into something out of a holiday painting, every room glowing with candlelight and fresh greenery, the main tree in the hall lit and shimmering, the scent of the evening's feast filling every corner of the estate. Relatives continued to arrive throughout the day, filling the halls with laughter and conversation, and Emma found herself swept along in the current of it all, introduced to cousins and family friends whose names she struggled to keep track of, each greeting warmer than the formal reception she had received on her first day. As evening approached, Emma retreated to her room to change for the Christmas Eve dinner, choosing a simple dark green dress from the small selection Olivia had insisted on lending her earlier that day. She studied her reflection in the mirror for a long moment, thinking about how strange and wonderful the past few days had been, how far removed this felt from the airport bench she had expected to spend the holiday on. A soft knock sounded at her door, and she opened it to find Julian standing in the hallway, dressed in a dark suit that made him look, if possible, even more composed than usual, though his expression softened the moment he saw her. "You look wonderful," he said, something quiet and sincere in his voice. "Olivia's doing," Emma said, smoothing the front of the dress. "She has better taste than I do, apparently." "I doubt that." Julian offered his arm, and Emma took it, the two of them making their way down the grand staircase together toward the dining room, where the rest of the family had already begun to gather. Dinner that evening felt different from the formal meal of their first night, the atmosphere warmer, looser, filled with laughter and stories exchanged across the long table. Even Nathaniel seemed more at ease, engaging Emma in a longer conversation about her architectural work, offering thoughtful questions rather than the pointed, assessing ones from before. Emma found herself relaxing into the evening, the earlier tension of her arrival giving way to something closer to belonging. After dinner, the family gathered in the main sitting room, where a fire crackled warmly in the hearth and soft music played from a record player in the corner. Gifts were exchanged among family members, small and sentimental, rather than extravagant, and Emma watched the scene with a quiet ache in her chest, grateful to be included in something that felt, despite everything, genuinely warm. Later in the evening, as the gathering began to wind down and relatives drifted off toward their rooms or the sitting areas for quiet conversation, Julian found Emma standing alone on the terrace outside the main hall, wrapped in a borrowed coat against the cold night air, looking up at a sky finally clear of storm clouds, stars scattered brightly across the darkness above the snow-covered gardens. "Escaping the crowd?" he asked, joining her at the railing. "Just needed a moment," Emma said, glancing at him with a small smile. "It's a lot, all of this. In a good way. I know the feeling." Julian looked up at the stars for a moment before turning his attention back to her. "I wanted to thank you for coming here, for all of this. I don't think I realized how much this house needed someone like you until you walked through the door." "I think the house needed to remember what it used to be," Emma said softly. "I just happened to be here for it." Julian studied her for a long moment, the cold night air doing nothing to diminish the warmth building steadily between them. "I don't think that's entirely true," he said quietly. "I think it needed you, specifically. I know it did, because I did." Emma's breath caught slightly at his words, the honesty in them unmistakable, stripped of the careful composure he usually wore. She took a small step closer, close enough now that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, reflecting the light from the windows behind them. "Julian," she started, though she wasn't entirely sure what she meant to say next. He reached up, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face, his hand lingering near her cheek, and for a long moment, neither of them moved, the space between them charged with everything unspoken over the past few days. The airport, the storm, the quiet mornings in the garden, the moment at the window the night before. "I've wanted to do this since the airport," Julian murmured, his voice barely above a whisper, leaning closer. Emma's heart raced, every instinct telling her to close the last small distance between them, when the terrace door opened abruptly behind them, spilling warm light and the sound of laughter out into the cold night air. Olivia appeared in the doorway, clearly searching for someone, before stopping short at the sight of them. "Oh," Olivia said, her eyebrows rising in immediate understanding. "I am so sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt. I was just looking for the extra blankets. Father wants to—" "It's fine," Julian said quickly, stepping back slightly, though his expression remained warm despite the interruption. "What does he need?" "Nothing urgent, apparently," Olivia said, still glancing between the two of them with poorly hidden amusement. "I'll just, let you two finish whatever this was." She retreated back inside, the door closing softly behind her, leaving Emma and Julian standing on the terrace in the aftermath of the interrupted moment, both slightly flustered, a nervous laugh escaping Emma despite the lingering tension in the air. "Well," Julian said, running a hand through his hair, "that was well timed." "Very," Emma agreed, though her heart was still racing, the moment before the interruption still hanging vividly in her mind. They stood together a while longer, the earlier intimacy of the moment softened but not entirely gone, replaced by an easier, quieter closeness as they watched the stars above the snow-covered gardens. Neither of them mentioned the almost kiss again that night, though it lingered between them, unspoken but understood, a promise of something neither of them was quite ready to name, but both of them were beginning to feel with growing certainty. Eventually, the cold drove them back inside, where the fire still crackled warmly in the sitting room, and the last of the family lingered over quiet conversation before retiring for the night. Emma said her goodnights and made her way up to her room, her thoughts full of the terrace, the stars, the warmth of Julian's hand against her cheek, carrying the memory with her long after she had settled into bed, staring up at the ceiling with a small, private smile she couldn't quite suppress. Downstairs, Julian remained by the fire a while longer, staring into the flames with an expression his father recognized from years long past, one Nathaniel hadn't seen on his son's face since before the house had grown so quiet. He said nothing, only watched with a small, knowing smile of his own, grateful for whatever storm had brought this unexpected warmth back into his family's Christmas. Christmas morning began quietly, the household still recovering from the late night before, though a different kind of tension arrived before breakfast had even been served. Julian was in the study, checking messages on his phone out of old habit, when an email caught his attention that made his stomach tighten with an unfamiliar dread. The subject line was simple, almost casual, but the sender's name was one he recognized immediately: Victor Lang, a rival developer who had spent years trying, unsuccessfully, to outmaneuver Julian's company on several major contracts. The email contained no threats, no direct accusations, only a brief, pointed message asking whether Julian had time for a call regarding certain irregularities in a land acquisition deal from several years earlier, one that had been handled quietly at the time and had never resurfaced since. Attached to the email was a single document, a scanned copy of paperwork Julian hadn't seen in years, paperwork that, if made public, could unravel not just the deal itself, but the reputation his father had spent decades building. Julian stared at the screen for a long moment, the warmth of the previous night's terrace conversation replaced by a cold, familiar tightness in his chest. He had thought this particular matter buried long ago, a minor irregularity in a complicated deal, handled discreetly to avoid unnecessary complications for people who had no part in the original decision. Apparently, Victor Lang had found it anyway, and apparently, he intended to use it. He was still staring at the screen when Emma found him, drawn by the unusual quiet coming from the study on what should have been a cheerful holiday morning. "Everything all right?" she asked, stepping into the room. Julian closed the laptop quickly, though not quickly enough to hide the tension in his expression. Business matter. Nothing that can't wait until after the holiday. Emma studied him carefully, unconvinced by the deflection. "You don't have to tell me what it is, but I can see it's bothering you, and I'd rather you not pretend otherwise, especially not today." Julian exhaled slowly, weighing how much to share. He had spent years keeping the details of his business dealings entirely separate from anything personal, a habit built from necessity rather than choice. But something about the past few days had already begun to erode that instinct, and looking at Emma now, he found he didn't want to keep this particular weight entirely to himself. "A rival of mine has found something," he said finally. "An old business matter, handled years ago, before I fully took over the company. It wasn't illegal, not exactly, but it wasn't entirely clean either, and if it becomes public, it could damage my father's reputation significantly, along with the company's standing with several major partners." "What kind of matter?" Emma asked gently. "A land deal. My father secured a piece of property years ago through channels that weren't entirely transparent, using influence rather than an open bidding process. It benefited the company enormously at the time, and it's been quiet ever since. But if Victor Lang goes public with the paperwork he apparently has, it will look far worse than it actually was, and there won't be much room to explain the nuance." Emma absorbed this information quietly, understanding immediately the weight it carried, not just for Julian's company, but for the fragile warmth that had begun returning to this house over the past few days. What does he want in exchange for staying quiet? "I don't know yet," Julian admitted. "He hasn't said directly. Men like Victor rarely do, not until they're certain they have the advantage fully in hand." "Will you call him?" Julian considered the question, glancing toward the closed laptop on the desk. "I don't see another option. Ignoring it won't make the paperwork disappear, and if he's serious about going public, I need to understand exactly what he intends to do before I can respond." Then you should call him, Emma said. But not today. Today is Christmas, and your family is downstairs waiting for you, and whatever Victor Lang wants can survive one more day of quiet. Julian looked at her for a long moment, something in her steady, practical calm settling the tightness in his chest slightly, though the worry remained close beneath the surface. You make it sound simple. It's not simple, Emma said, but it doesn't have to consume today either. You can face it tomorrow with a clear head, rather than tonight with a room full of family watching you disappear into worry. Julian nodded slowly, recognizing the wisdom in her words, even as the weight of the email lingered at the edge of his thoughts. All right. Today, at least, belongs to everyone downstairs. They made their way down to the main hall together, where the family had already begun gathering around the tree for the traditional exchange of Christmas morning gifts. Emma watched Julian carefully throughout the morning, noticing the moments when his attention drifted, when a distant, calculating expression crossed his face before he caught himself and returned his focus to the room. She said nothing about it, respecting the boundary he had drawn around the day, though she remained quietly aware of the tension simmering beneath the surface of his composed exterior. The gift exchange passed pleasantly enough, filled with laughter and the particular warmth of a family choosing, for one day at least, to set aside the formality that usually governed their interactions. Nathaniel presented Julian with a set of cufflinks that had belonged to his own father, a gesture that seemed to carry more weight than the simple object itself suggested, and Olivia teased Emma good-naturedly about the small, thoughtful gift she had managed to find for each of them, despite arriving with almost nothing. It wasn't until the early afternoon, during a quiet lull between the morning's festivities and the preparations for the evening meal, that Julian's phone rang with a number he recognized immediately. He excused himself quietly, stepping into the study and closing the door behind him, leaving Emma to watch the closed door with a growing sense of unease she couldn't quite shake. Inside the study, Julian answered the call with careful composure, though his grip on the phone tightened as Victor Lang's voice came through, smooth and confident in a way that immediately set Julian on edge. "Julian," Victor said, his tone friendly, in a way that felt entirely calculated. "I hope I'm not interrupting your holiday." "You are," Julian replied flatly. "What do you want, Victor?" "Straight to business." "I respect that." There was a brief pause, the sound of ice shifting in a glass on the other end of the line. "I came across some interesting paperwork recently, from an old acquisition your father handled. I imagine you've had time to review the document I sent." "I have." "Then you understand the position you're in. That deal wouldn't look particularly good under public scrutiny, and I have several journalists who would be very interested in the details, particularly given the timing, with your company's new development proposal currently under review by the City Council." Julian's jaw tightened, the calculated nature of the threat becoming clearer with every word. "What do you want, Victor? I doubt you called on Christmas Day out of nostalgia." "Withdraw your company's bid on the Riverside Development Project," Victor said, his tone shifting into something harder now that the pretense had fallen away. "Let my company take the contract without competition, and this old paperwork stays exactly where it's been for years, buried and forgotten. Refuse, and I'll make sure every relevant party sees exactly how your father built part of his empire." "That project has been in development for 8 months, Julian said, his voice tightly controlled despite the anger building beneath the surface. "You're asking me to hand you a 9-figure contract to protect a decision my father made before I even had a say in company matters." "I'm asking you to make a choice," Victor said simply. "Protect your family's reputation, or protect a contract. You have until the new year to decide." The call ended before Julian could respond further, leaving him standing alone in the study, the phone still pressed against his ear long after the line had gone dead. He set it down slowly, staring out the window at the snow-covered gardens, the weight of the choice settling heavily across his shoulders, threatening to unravel not just the company's future, but the fragile peace that had only just begun returning to his family's Christmas. Emma found him still standing by the window in the study nearly 20 minutes later, the light outside beginning to shift toward the early winter evening. She had waited as long as she could manage before her worry outweighed her desire to give him space, and the moment she saw his expression, she understood the call had gone exactly as poorly as he had feared. "Tell me," she said simply, closing the door behind her. Julian recounted the conversation carefully, his voice controlled but tight, the full weight of Victor Lang's ultimatum settling over the room as he spoke. Emma listened without interrupting, absorbing the details, understanding immediately the impossible position he had been placed in. "Withdraw an 8-month bid, or risk your father's reputation and the company's standing," she repeated once he finished. "That's not a choice. That's a trap." "I'm aware," Julian said, running a hand through his hair, the composed exterior he usually maintained cracking slightly under the pressure. "And it's not even really about the contract for him. Victor has been trying to undermine this company for years. This is just the excuse he's been waiting for." "What will you tell your father?" Julian was quiet for a long moment, the question clearly one he had been avoiding since the call ended. "I don't know yet. He built this company with decisions I don't fully understand, made in a different time, under different pressures. I don't know how to tell him that something from his past is about to become a weapon against everything he's worked for." "He deserves to know," Emma said gently. "Not because you owe Victor Lang anything, but because your father is the one who made the original decision, and he should have a say in how it's handled now." Julian nodded slowly, though the reluctance remained clear in his expression. "You're right. I just don't want tonight to be the night I tell him. Not on Christmas." "Then don't," Emma said. "But don't wait too long either. Victor gave you until the new year. That's not much time to decide something this important, especially if it involves your father's reputation as much as your company's future." Julian studied her for a long moment, something steadying in her calm, practical presence that helped settle the storm of worry building inside him. "How is it that you always seem to know exactly the right thing to say?" "I don't always," Emma admitted with a small smile. "But I've learned that most problems get smaller once you stop carrying them alone." Julian crossed the room and pulled her into a quiet embrace, one that carried more weight than words could manage in that moment. Grateful beyond measure for her steady presence amid the chaos Victor Lang had just introduced into what should have been an easy, peaceful holiday. Emma held him for a long moment, feeling the tension slowly begin to ease from his shoulders, before they finally separated, both aware that the evening's family gathering awaited them downstairs, regardless of the storm quietly building behind the study door. They rejoined the family for the evening meal, Julian doing his best to mask the tension still coiled beneath his composed exterior, though Emma noticed Nathaniel watching his son with a careful, assessing gaze throughout dinner, as though sensing something had shifted since the morning, without yet knowing what. It wasn't until later that evening, after most of the family had retired for the night, that Nathaniel found Julian alone in the study, the same room where the difficult call had taken place hours earlier. "You've been distracted all evening," Nathaniel said, closing the door behind him. "I know that expression. It's the one you wear when something has gone wrong that you don't yet know how to fix." Julian considered denying it, out of old habit, before deciding against it, the events of the day and Emma's steady encouragement pushing him toward honesty rather than avoidance. "Victor Lang called this afternoon." Nathaniel's expression sharpened immediately at the name. What did he want? Julian explained the situation carefully, watching his father's face shift from confusion to recognition to a heavy, resigned understanding as the details of the old land deal came back to him. When Julian finished, Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, staring at the fire crackling in the hearth, years of memory clearly moving behind his eyes. "I made that decision a long time ago," Nathaniel said finally, his voice quieter than Julian had heard it in years. "Under different circumstances, with different pressures, and I convinced myself at the time that it was justified, that the ends outweighed the means. I never imagined it would resurface like this, years later, threatening everything we've built since." "I don't know what to do, Father," Julian admitted. "Withdrawing the bid protects the company's public standing, but it also means walking away from 8 months of work and handing Victor Lang exactly what he wants. Refusing means risking everything the paperwork could expose. Nathaniel was quiet for a long while, considering the weight of the choice with the same seriousness he had brought to every difficult decision throughout his career. Finally, he spoke, his voice steady despite the gravity of what he was about to say. "Don't withdraw the bid," he said. "Whatever consequences come from that old decision, I'll answer for them myself. I won't let this company be built on the foundation of hiding from mistakes I made years ago, and I certainly won't let Victor Lang dictate our future through threats. If the truth comes out, we'll face it honestly, and we'll let people judge the whole picture rather than the version Victor wants them to see. Father, this could damage everything. Your reputation, the company's partnerships, everything you've worked for." "Perhaps," Nathaniel said. "Or perhaps it will simply prove that we're willing to stand by our decisions, good and bad, rather than hide behind threats. I would rather face that consequence honestly than watch you compromise this company's integrity to protect a mistake I made long before you were even part of these decisions." Julian studied his father for a long moment, something shifting in his understanding of the man who had always seemed so composed, so unshakable throughout his entire life. This admission, this willingness to face consequences openly rather than hide behind influence or threats, felt like a different side of his father than he had seen in years, closer to the man Olivia had described from before their mother's passing. "All right," Julian said finally. "We hold the bid. We face whatever comes." Nathaniel nodded, a rare, genuine warmth crossing his expression. "Good. Now go find Emma. I imagine she's waiting to hear how tonight's conversation went, and I suspect her opinion on the matter helped guide you here more than you're willing to admit." Julian allowed himself a small smile at that, grateful for his father's uncharacteristic perceptiveness. "She usually knows the right path before I do." "Then hold on to her," Nathaniel said simply, before turning back toward the fire, leaving Julian to make his way back through the quiet house in search of Emma, carrying with him both the weight of the decision ahead and a new, unexpected closeness with his father that the events of this Christmas had somehow managed to restore. The days following Christmas moved quickly once the household began preparing for the family's return to ordinary life, though the shadow of Victor Lang's ultimatum lingered at the edges of every conversation Julian had with his father about the company's next steps. Emma stayed on through the days after the holiday, the roads still recovering enough from the storm that travel remained complicated, though neither she nor Julian seemed particularly eager to rush the arrangement to an end. On the 28th, Julian received a message from his legal team confirming that the paperwork Victor Lang had referenced was, as expected, technically legal despite the questionable manner in which the original deal had been arranged. There would be no criminal exposure, only reputational risk, a distinction that mattered greatly for the company's legal standing, but did little to ease the tension building toward the looming showdown with their rival. "We need a plan," Julian said, pacing the length of the study while Emma watched from the window seat, a cup of tea warming her hands. "If Victor goes public before we're ready, we lose control of the narrative entirely. It becomes a story about hidden wrongdoing, rather than a story about a company willing to be transparent about past mistakes." "Then get ahead of it," Emma said simply. "Don't wait for Victor to control the story. Tell it yourselves, on your own terms, before he has the chance." Julian paused his pacing, considering her words carefully. "You mean release the information ourselves, before he can?" "Exactly. Get out in front of it. Explain the context. Acknowledge the mistake honestly, and show that the company has grown and changed since then. It's much harder for Victor Lang to use something as a weapon once you've already handed people the full picture yourselves." Julian stared at her for a long moment, something like admiration crossing his expression. "That's either brilliant or reckless, possibly both." "Most good ideas are," Emma said with a small smile. He brought the idea to his father the following morning, and after a long discussion involving the company's legal and communications teams, the decision was made to move forward with a carefully worded public statement, acknowledging the old land deal, explaining the context and the changes made in company practices since then, and emphasizing the transparency the family now wished to bring to their business dealings going forward. It was a risk, undeniably, but one that felt far more aligned with the man Nathaniel had described wanting to be than simply capitulating to Victor Lang's threats. The statement was released on the morning of the 30th, timed carefully to reach the press before Victor Lang had any opportunity to release his version of events first. Julian spent the day fielding calls from concerned partners and curious journalists, his father standing firmly beside him throughout each conversation, taking full responsibility for the original decision rather than allowing Julian to shoulder blame for something that had happened before he held any real authority in the company. By evening, the initial wave of concern had largely settled, replaced by a surprising undercurrent of respect for the company's willingness to address the matter openly rather than waiting to be exposed. Several of Julian's longtime business partners reached out personally to express their continued confidence in the company, citing the transparency of the statement as evidence of integrity rather than weakness. Victor Lang's attempt to leverage the information collapsed almost entirely once the company had already claimed the narrative for itself. A brief, bitter statement from his own company followed a day later, attempting to cast doubt on the sincerity of Julian's transparency, but it landed with little impact against a story that had already been told honestly and thoroughly by the people it concerned most. Julian found Emma in the garden on the afternoon the crisis finally seemed to settle, sitting on the same stone bench where she had spent time alone during her first days at the estate, watching the last of the melting snow drip steadily from the branches of the surrounding trees. "It worked," he said, sitting down beside her. "The bid stays intact. My father's reputation took a hit, but nothing close to what Victor intended, and several partners have actually reached out to praise the transparency." "I'm glad," Emma said, genuine relief in her voice. "How does your father feel about it?" "Lighter somehow, like he's been carrying that decision for years without realizing how heavy it had become." Julian glanced toward the house, where Nathaniel could be seen through one of the windows, engaged in an animated conversation with Olivia, something Emma hadn't witnessed since her arrival. "I think facing it honestly gave him something back that he'd lost a long time ago. Sometimes the things we hide end up costing us more than the truth ever would," Emma said quietly. Julian turned to look at her, the weight of the past few days settling into something steadier now, something closer to peace. "You keep saying things like that, and I keep realizing how much I needed to hear them." "Maybe that's just what happens when two strangers get stuck in an airport together," Emma said with a small smile. "Maybe," Julian agreed, reaching for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers with a quiet certainty that hadn't been there during their tentative first days together. "Though I don't think stranger is quite the right word anymore." Emma looked down at their joined hands, then up at him, something warm and steady settling in her chest, entirely different from the anxious uncertainty she had carried through the storm just days earlier. "No," she agreed softly. "I don't think it is." They sat together in the garden a while longer, watching the last of the snow melt slowly from the branches above, the crisis behind them, and something new, still fragile, but growing steadier by the day, taking root between them in its place. The final days of the year arrived quietly at the estate, the household settling back into a calmer rhythm now that the storm of both weather and family crisis had finally passed. Roads had cleared enough by the 31st for normal travel to resume, and airport service, Emma learned through a brief message from the airline, had returned to its regular schedule days earlier, the storm that had once seemed so all-consuming already fading into memory for most of the world beyond the estate's snow-covered gardens. Emma stood in the guest room on the morning of New Year's Eve, her suitcase open on the bed, its broken wheels still a small, stubborn reminder of how this entire journey had begun. She hadn't yet decided when she would return home, though the question had been growing steadily at the back of her mind over the past 2 days, unavoidable now that the practical obstacles keeping her here had finally cleared. A knock sounded at her door, and she opened it to find Julian standing in the hallway, his expression thoughtful in a way that suggested he had been turning over some question of his own. "I saw the airline confirmation on your phone earlier," he said. "Flights are running again." "They are," Emma confirmed, stepping aside to let him into the room. "I suppose I should think about heading back soon. My apartment isn't going to miss itself, and I do have work waiting for me after the holidays." Julian nodded, though something in his expression suggested the practical reality of her departure weighed on him more than he was letting on. "I understand. I just wanted to say, before you go, that these past days have meant more to me than I think I properly know how to express." Emma set down the shirt she had been folding, giving him her full attention. "They've meant a great deal to me too, Julian. More than I expected, honestly. I came here as a stranger stuck at an airport, and I'm leaving feeling like I've found something I didn't even know I was looking for." "Then don't leave," Julian said, the words coming out more directly than he had perhaps intended, though he didn't retract them once spoken. "Not entirely, I mean. I know you have your own life, your own work, your own apartment waiting for you. I'm not asking you to give any of that up. I'm only asking whether there might be room in it for this. For us." Emma's heart quickened at his words, the uncertainty she had been carrying about their future dissolving into something clearer and steadier in the space of his honest admission. "I think there's room," she said softly. "I think there's been room since that first night in the lounge, if I'm honest with myself." Julian crossed the room and took her hands in his, the same warmth from their moment on the terrace on Christmas Eve, returning now without the interruption that had once cut it short. "I don't know exactly what this looks like, practically speaking. My life is complicated, and my company demands a great deal of my time, and you have your own career to build. But I know that whatever this is between us, I don't want it to end simply because a storm happened to clear and flights happened to resume." "Neither do I," Emma said, her voice steady despite the emotion building in her chest. This time, when Julian leaned down, there was no interruption to stop him, no door opening at the wrong moment, no sister arriving in search of blankets. Their kiss was gentle at first, careful, as though both of them were still testing the reality of the moment, before deepening into something more certain, more sure of itself, everything unspoken between them finally finding its answer. When they finally separated, Emma laughed softly, resting her forehead against his. "That took long enough. I was beginning to think the universe simply didn't want it to happen," Julian said, a genuine smile breaking across his face, one Emma hadn't seen from him even during the warmest moments of the past week. They spent the rest of the morning discussing practical matters with a lightness neither of them had expected to feel. Emma's return to the city, the possibility of Julian visiting during his less demanding weeks, the slow, careful work of building something real between two people whose lives, until a week ago, had existed in entirely separate worlds. Neither of them pretended the road ahead would be simple, but neither of them doubted, either, that it was worth walking. That evening, the family gathered once more for a quiet New Year's Eve dinner, smaller and more relaxed than the grand Christmas Eve celebration, most of the extended relatives having already returned to their own homes. Nathaniel raised a toast as midnight approached, his voice carrying a warmth Emma hadn't heard from him during her first uncertain days at the estate. "To new beginnings," he said, raising his glass toward the assembled family, his gaze lingering meaningfully on Julian and Emma seated together near the fire. "And to storms that, every so often, bring us exactly what we didn't know we needed." Emma smiled, raising her own glass, feeling Julian's hand find hers beneath the table as the countdown to midnight began among the small gathering. As the clock struck 12 and the family exchanged quiet embraces and well wishes for the year ahead, Julian pulled Emma close, pressing a soft kiss to her temple. "Happy New Year, Emma," he murmured. "Happy New Year, Julian," she replied, leaning into him, feeling entirely, unexpectedly at home in a house that had, only a week earlier, belonged to a stranger she had met over a spilled cup of coffee. 2 days later, Emma finally boarded her long-delayed flight home, though this time, the departure felt entirely different from the frantic, lonely scramble of the original journey. Julian accompanied her to the airport himself, standing with her near the same gate where their story had first begun, the terminal now calm and orderly, nothing like the chaos of the storm that had once filled it. "This feels strangely familiar," Emma said, glancing around the gate area with a small, nostalgic smile. "Try not to spill any coffee on strangers this time," Julian said, and Emma laughed, swatting his arm lightly. "No promises." He pulled her into a final embrace before her boarding call, holding her close for a long moment. "I'll see you soon," he said. "I mean that." "I know you do," Emma replied, pressing a soft kiss to his lips before stepping back reluctantly toward the boarding line. "Call me when you land back at the office and survive your first meeting without me telling you what to say." "I make no promises about that either," Julian said, and Emma laughed again, the sound carrying warmly through the terminal as she made her way toward the gate, glancing back once to see him still standing there, watching her go with the same quiet warmth that had first drawn her to him during that long, snowbound night. As her flight lifted off into a clear winter sky, leaving behind the terminal, the estate, and the storm that had brought two strangers together in the most unexpected way, Emma looked out the window at the world stretching bright and open beneath her, carrying with her the certain, steady knowledge that whatever storms might come next, she wouldn't be facing them alone. Somewhere below, in an office much like the one where his ordinary life would soon resume, Julian Hart carried that same knowledge with him, a quiet, certain warmth settling into a life that had, for so long, felt like it was missing something essential, until a storm, and a stranger, had finally brought it home.